Welcome everybody to today's webinar on, as Darren already mentioned, understanding air leakage in attached dwellings. As Darren also mentioned, today's presentation has been approved through AIA for 1 LUHSW. Looking at today's description, we're going to look at some different areas within the attached dwelling units that are commonplace or difficult for air sealing and things of that nature. Not only will we take a look at them, find out where they are, but we will also look at some remedies on how to help air seal those specific areas. So looking through our learning objectives, first and foremost, we hope to identify some air leakage trouble spots in that building envelope that could lead to a decrease in energy efficiency. Then we'll review some additional trouble spots with specific products on the market that can help reduce those air leakage areas. We want to understand alternative designs, and through a case study at the end of today's presentation, we'll look at an alternative air sealing method that could be beneficial to some cases, not all cases, but some cases. And then finally here, we'll look at, one of the most commonly used area separation wall, or ASW, that's being used and what that sound transmittance or STC rating is on that, and take a look at one of the appendices out of the IRC. Again, understanding that, the UCC does not acknowledge appendices, but it is there for a reference, and knowing that, there is an STC rating that we should probably meet, and what these common design methods do come out with at the backside. I would like to say, this disclaimer is here. If you're familiar with the PHRC, you know that we don't promote any specific products or methods, but we like to provide multiple different options or materials that can be used to achieve one common goal. That's kind of what we're going to go through here today. Some of the details that we look at are from a specific manufacturer or supplier, whatever the case may be. That does not necessarily mean that we're promoting that. It's just, we pull resources from areas, and it is at that point what it is. Same thing when we come to the case study, we'll be looking at an alternative method. Again, it's just an option available to you, and it's up to you as a designer or a builder to choose the product and material or method that works best for your design. And hopefully going through this webinar and the majority of what the PHRC produces and put out, that's our intent. So first and foremost, why do we air seal? And I have, 2018, it should be 2018 IRC, because we are going to, throughout today's presentation, we will be looking at some 2021 provisions that aren't in effect yet here in Pennsylvania, but if you are following along with any of the code update process happening within Pennsylvania, it is coming. A quick look into that is there is an anticipated date of implementation of July 13th of 2025, and we at the PHRC will be producing some modules, code update modules that we will be releasing through speaking engagements, as well as additional webinars throughout the next 18 months. But those programs will be available well before that. We're looking late 2024, early 2025 to have those released. So keep that in mind. But jumping back to this, why do we air seal? Again, looking at what's currently enforceable here within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is the 2018 IRC. Looking at N1102.4, which is air leakage, and it says that the building thermal envelope shall be constructed to limit air leakage in accordance with the requirements of section R1102.4.1 through .5. What I really want to touch on here is the N1102.4.1, the building thermal envelope. That's where I'm going to focus in the beginning portion of today's presentation, giving a foundation or an understanding as to why we need to look at this air leakage requirement, and how to begin that process in closing off the building thermal envelope to limit air infiltration. So N1102.4.1 building thermal envelope states that the building thermal envelope shall comply with sections N1102.4.1.1 and .2. They are listed here below. being the installation of materials and the testing methods. It also goes on to state that, sealing methods between dissimilar materials shall allow for differential expansion and contraction. All the materials have to be compatible with each other. Not only do they have to be compatible with the installation process themselves, but they need to be compatible for the longevity of those products being installed on those dwellings. And that takes into case here, the sealing methods between dissimilar materials shall allow for differential expansion and contraction. So if one moves more than the other, there's the possibility that there could be cracks opening up, gaps where air can move through that. If you've attended any of my sessions prior, I've stated that water typically moves, and this is a good concept to keep in mind through this presentation, that water, when we're talking water resistive barriers and things of that nature, water tends to move based on gravity, right? So if water hits the the cladding or the side of a structure, it then falls down due to gravity. I understand that there may be some wicking that could happen, things of that nature, but when you transition from looking how water moves and then how air moves completely different. Air moves based on pressure. So if you have a pressure difference from one area to the next, it can go up, down, left, right. There is no discrepancy in how air can move. So that's why all of this is very, very important. It's not just simply lapping. Sealing is key when it comes to air infiltration. So we're quickly going to look at installation and testing, but we're going to start off here with testing. So this is on 1102.4.1.2 testing. And again, the 2018 IRC states that the building or dwelling unit shall be tested and verified. And within our climatic zones in Pennsylvania, we must, because we're in zones 3 through 8. Currently, we have within Pennsylvania 4, 5, and 6. So within zones 4, 5, and 6, it must be tested to not exceed 3 air changes per hour. And then a written report shall be submitted to the building code official. So what does that look like? I get it. I understand that a lot of this is a recap to a lot of you, but I still want to make sure that I set this foundation correctly when looking at how this testing is achieved, how it's done, and then how you have to understand again how air moves to more effectively seal against the movement of air. So looking at this image over here on the right-hand side, this kind of depicts the exterior visual image of how blower door testing is done. We have a house, and then you can see in the front door, we have a blue arrow. That is exhausting air from the interior of the dwelling unit. When you're exhausting air through that fan, you're creating a depressurized home. And then all of these yellow arrows pointing at the home, they represent areas where you can have gaps and cracks and voids where air can then be drawn from the outside into the structure, right? So the blower door concept is depressurizing the home to exaggerate the pressure difference between quantifying air infiltration compared to an established benchmark. So this is all done through air changes per hour or ACH at a certain pressure. So the fan that's in the door depressurizes the house to a certain pressure, and that is 50 pascals. Again, currently here in Pennsylvania, it needs to be a depressurization to 50 pascals, and then through an equation, which we'll look at here, it must be not exceeding three air changes per hour. If you're wondering what 50 pascals of pressure represents, it's very similar to roughly a 20 mile per hour wind on all sides of the home. And it's important to say all sides of the home. Here is a note that says it's 20 miles per hour wind on the house. It's a little bit of a misrepresentation. It should be a 20 mile per hour wind on all sides of the house. It's creating that pressure everywhere, and that is then giving you your roughly 50 pascals. So again, this image here on the left-hand side is similar to what we saw on the previous slide, where we have a blower door here in the front door being shown here, where it's, exhausting air out, and then all these blue arrows are kind of showing where air is being drawn into the house through gaps and cracks, right? Here's the equation that I was talking about. Our end goal, or the value that we need, is air changes per hour, again at 50 pascals. And that's the calculation is done by looking at the volume of the house interior. So that's your denominator. Then you look at your CFM 50, which is your cubic feet per minute at 50 pascals. What that represents is once we hit a depressurization inside of this structure, there's a sensor in that fan that reads the amount of air still flowing through that fan. That's your cubic feet per minute at a negative 50 Pascal. And then you have to convert that because we're looking for air changes per hour, and this is CFM or cubic feet per minute. So we have to multiply that times 60. Ultimately, when you go through that equation, your end goal or your end result has to be shall not exceed 3. And again, we'll go through this with an example here in a little bit. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is, remember, we had testing, right? That was one requirement for checking or verifying air leakage. The other one is installation. And this just states that the components of the building thermal envelope as listed in this table, and we'll take a look at a couple things in that table, shall be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's installation instructions and viewed upon through this table. This is a table that has changed in name. I remember being able to call this the insulation installation table or chart, right? And that's still part of the title for this, but it has since grown to air barrier, air sealing, and insulation installation. What I want to look at is these first 3 items, the components, really kind of set the groundwork for air sealing. So your component at the top here, the first one is your general requirements, and looking at the air barrier criteria, it says that a continuous air barrier shall be installed in the building envelope. And the key word here is continuous. And then it says below that breaks or joints in the air barrier shall be sealed. So again, jumping back to what I said earlier in the comparison between an air barrier and a water resistive barrier, they can be the same material. However, even if they are the same material, I can almost guarantee you that the installation instructions are not going to be the same, whether it's going to be installed as an air barrier or a water resistive barrier. Because, as I said, air will move based on pressure. So if it's not sealed, or if those breaks or joints are not sealed completely, not just overlapping, you're going to have air infiltration. So the installation is key in knowing which barrier or which control layer you are installing. Jumping down to walls here, looking at the junction of the foundation and sill plate that shall be sealed, and we'll look at a picture of that. And the junction of the top plate, we'll also see some pictures of that. And knee walls, we're not going to get into knee walls or attic trusses or bonus room trusses at this point in this presentation. We have quite a few other recorded webinars on our website that you can jump to that'll talk a little bit more about sealing of the knee walls, especially in bonus room trusses, which can be extremely difficult. If you want some more information on that, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to share some resources with you. And I can also direct you to the webinar that I provided or that I gave last year. I believe it was last year, looking at the installation of those air sealing bonus room trusses. It's all in the details, I think is what it is, or comfort in bonus rooms. It's all in the details. That gives a really good look into the details for the knee walls. Thank you, Rachel, for putting that out in the chat. So as I said again earlier, that not only would we be looking at the air sealing requirements out of the 2018, because that's currently where we are, I wanted to look forward a little bit. We are getting into this development stage for the new 2021 codes coming out, and there are some changes. So I feel that it's important to point them out as we go along to help prepare the industry. That's our job. We want to prepare the industry for our end goal, and that's providing the best end product for the consumer. So taking a look at the testing portion, it did change, but before we all flip a table and get upset at the change, hear me out as we're going to go through what these changes are, and it does make the testing requirement a little bit easier to comply with. So I'm going to go through this. The building or dwelling unit shall be tested for air leakage. That's exactly the same as what you're going to read in the 2018. However, here's where the change comes in. The maximum air leakage rate for any building or dwelling unit under any compliance path shall not exceed 5 air changes per hour, or 0.28 cubic feet per minute per square foot of a dwelling unit enclosure, and that also has to be tested at 50 pascals. So I'm not gonna touch on the beginning portion here that says shall not exceed 5 air changes per hour, because there's a little bit of a different caveat that comes into play later on in this provision. But what I do want to touch on, the new provision that I do want to relay to you folks is the or 0.28 cubic feet per minute, or yeah, cubic feet per minute per square foot of dwelling unit enclosure area, which is a new, I would say, term, but it's more than one word. But it's a new definition that is in the 2021. But again, this is also done at 50 pascals. So taking a look at the dwelling unit enclosure area, this is defined out of Chapter 11, out of the IRC, and this definition is also in the residential chapter, Chapter 4 out of the IECC. And this is the unit enclosure area is defined as being the sum of the area of the ceiling, floors, and walls separating a dwelling unit's conditioned space from the exterior or from adjacent conditioned or unconditioned spaces. Um, so as you can see here, when we're talking about separating one unit's conditioned space from an adjacent conditioned space, that really lays the groundwork as to how this can comply with what we're going to talk about here today, meaning attached dwelling units. Okay, so again, the new term dwelling unit enclosure area is the sum of the area of the ceiling, the floors, and the walls separating a unit's conditioned space from the exterior or from adjacent conditioned or unconditioned spaces. So it's almost encapsulating. You're looking at all 6 sides. If we're looking at a box here without multiple additional walls or geometry, we're looking at all sides of the dwelling unit. So this is the exception to this here, right? So we looked at this initial testing at 1102.4.1.2. Again, this is out of the 2021 IRC, looking at the 0.28 cubic feet per minute per square foot of dwelling unit enclosure area. The exception states that when testing individual dwelling units, an air leakage rate not exceeding 0.30 cubic feet per minute per square foot of dwelling unit enclosure area shall be permitted in all climate zones for um, these two areas. Number one being attached single and multifamily building dwelling units, and number two for buildings or dwelling units that are 1,500 square feet or smaller. That second one specifically applies to detached units, but we're going to look at number one here, that is attached single family and multifamily dwelling units. So to give a quick breakdown here, what does that exactly mean? Looking at the 2018 testing provisions, it's a volume-based test. So when looking at a volume-based test, it can be adversely affecting smaller homes more drastically than it does larger homes. And this is air changes per hour ACH, and it's defined as 3 in Pennsylvania, 3 ACH 50. Looking at the 2021 testing provisions, this is building an envelope or dwelling unit enclosure area based test. So now it's really looking at the areas in which air can leak, right? It's not going to, a home's not going to leak based on the volume. It's going to be based on the envelope. So it's taking a look at that square footage, and it's cubic feet per minute per square foot of dwelling unit enclosure area. And that can be defined, again, it's at 50 pascals and can be defined as, for instance, a 0.28 CFM 50 per square foot. So we're going to look at an example here. This example is going to look at a townhouse. This is some details of our example is that it's 1,496 square foot finished area, but it's 2,041 square foot of conditioned area. The reason they're different is because the basement is not finished. However, it is conditioned. And then our ceiling heights has a 9-foot basement, 8-foot first floor, and 8-foot second floor. Um, So looking at the 2018 air testing provisions, this is again what we're currently under, right? The example, quickly to jump back, this is what we have. We have our first floor, second floor, and then basement area. We have 5,472 cubic feet in the basement. We have 4,864 cubic feet in the first floor, and then 7,040 cubic feet in the second floor because we do have living space over top of the garage. That gives us a total area of 17,376 total cubic feet. I ran these numbers based on an assumption of 1,200 CFM. That's, remember, this 1,200 right here is the amount of airflow in cubic feet per minute exhausting through the fan at a negative 50 pascals in this home. So running this calculation, this comes out with a 4.1 ACH 50. Okay, and this under current 2018, remember it says that it shall not exceed 3 ACH 50. Therefore, this example would not pass under the 2018 air testing provisions. Moving this forward into 2021, we're no longer looking at the a volume-based test, right? This is no longer taking into account the volume. This is square foot of dwelling unit enclosure area. So our basement is, again, forgive me for running through these exact numbers, but precision matters. And what I want to state here is that the basement has 1,514 square foot of dwelling unit enclosure area. The first floor, again, we are jumping around the garage, but we are including the common wall between the house and the garage, and we have 960 square foot of dwelling unit, and the second floor has 1,904 square foot of dwelling unit enclosure area. You may be thinking, well, Chris, that doesn't make any sense because, well, why in the world is our basement square footage and our second floor square footage so much greater than our first floor? And remember, when we look back at the definition of dwelling unit enclosure area, it takes into account the walls, the floors, and the ceiling. So our basement is going to have a floor, right? We have our basement slab floor is separating conditioned space from unconditioned space. So not only are you taking into account the walls of that basement, but you're also taking into account the square footage of that basement floor. Same thing on the second floor, where we are taking a look at not only just our walls, but we have our ceiling separating our conditioned space from our attic space. That's why our basement and our second floor numbers are significantly higher than our first floor, because our first floor is specifically just looking at our exterior walls. So that gives us a total dwelling unit enclosure square footage of 4,378 square feet. You plug that into our calculation. Here we have 1,200 CFM. Again, we're looking at negative 50 pascals, and we're getting 1,200 CFM through that fan. We have a total square footage of enclosure area of 4,078. That gives us a 0.27 CFM 50 per square foot. This passes in 2021. So with all of that being said, these are the exact same air leakage, but just looking at the testing requirements and looking at a volume-based test versus the new square footage of dwelling unit enclosure area, this would pass in the 2021 provisions. So jumping into, some air sealing areas within dwelling units, this again is going to all be probably a refresher, a recap on the majority of this stuff, but some areas that need to be looked at for our air barriers and insulation, our general requirements, our ceiling and attic, our walls. These are all components out of the air barrier, air sealing, insulation, installation table. We already looked at a couple of those. The first one here, again, we already looked at this in table form, but this is the air barrier criteria. We're not going to look at the insulation installation criteria side over here on the right. We're going to mainly focus here on the air barrier criteria, which is the junction of the foundation and sill plate shall be sealed, and the junction at the top plate and the top of exterior wall shall be sealed. The best way to kind of look through this is the pen test. If you have done the pen test before, you can write a yes or a thumbs up or whatever you want there in the chat. But the pen test really kind of you look at a section of a house, you put the pen on it, and you kind of draw your line around it without lifting it up. And wherever the pen is, you should be able to declare what your air barrier is. So if we start here at the foundation wall, foundation slab intersection, and move up the wall, we can call this our foundation wall is going to be our air barrier. But looking at it from, this far out, it's easy to kind of overlook key details, right? So I just had that line go across the sill plate and now up that exterior wall. It can be easy to say, well, we have sill seal and then we have sheathing, right? But if you look at the intricacies that happen here, is that you have your top of concrete wall, and then you have your, depending on the product, you have your 1/8 inch or maybe a little bit thicker than that, sill seal, foam sill sealer, and then you have your sill plate being installed on top of that. Are we confident in that that is a true air seal? I ask that question quite often, and the answer is typically no, because you have some the top of that foundation wall could have some movement to it, and you may not necessarily be able to fill that void in with an 1/8 inch sill seal. So again, looking at this more in depth during the pen test all the way around the house, our dwelling unit is definitely something that should be taken into consideration, calling out at each individual small air sealing technique. This is, what happens when you're trying to get that next level air seal. That foundation wall, again, is not always going to be perfectly flat. You install that sill plate on top of it. Here we have a direct wall on top of a stem wall. This, y- you know, this doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's a sill plate with joists sitting on top of it. Either which way, you're still going to have that foundation wall, sill sealer, and then some sort of wood framing member on top of it that has to be air sealed. Here's talking about the again, looking back at that general requirement for the walls anyway, sealing that gap between the double top plate and then going around any sort of other void that you may have, separating the interior conditioned space from the exterior unconditioned space, sealing around the header, sealing around the joints in our sheathing. That's what's going on right here, right? We have our sheathing coming up to the top of the wall. There's going to be a break between this sheathing and the sheathing or roof, whatever the case may be, above that. So we want to make sure that that is also sealed. Whenever you have a butt joint happening of your sheathing over top of a stud, both sides of that stud should also be sealed in one way, shape, or form. But those type of sealing techniques fall into place on the majority of the homes that we build. We're fairly accustomed to them. So what we're envisioning here today is looking at air sealing trouble spots in townhouses, right? So I'm going to look at two areas. Both of which having to do with the area separation wall. The first one is the common wall, or your main area separation wall. The full length, this unit here that you can see here is 44 feet deep. So if you can imagine having an air leakage point 44 feet long, that could be upwards of, an eighth of an inch, quarter inch, whatever the case may be. That's a lot of air leakage. So we're going to take a look at the common wall, and then we're going to look at exterior wall intersections and offsets, and kind of how the code progressed in its language, going from 2015, which I don't have language on, but I can state what it does say, and then looking at the language in 2018 and looking where the language is going in 2021, and trying to limit that air leakage at our exterior wall intersections, where we have our two units coming together. When we get to those slides, it'll make a little bit more sense than me trying to explain it. But the first thing we want to look at is our common wall. There's a lot of different colors, well, two different colors on this slide, but the things I want to point out here is this is coming out of the 2021 IRC. Again, looking forward here. And it says that out of 302.2.2, which is common walls, says that the common wall separating townhouse units shall be assigned a fire resistant rating in accordance with items 1 and 2, which is either a 1 hour wall with sprinklers, or a 2 hour wall without sprinklers. We're going to focus on a 2 hour wall, even though it is sprinklered. Shall be rated for fire exposure from both sides. The common wall The common wall shared by two townhomes shall be constructed without plumbing, without mechanical equipment, ducts, or vents. It can have water-filled piping for the sprinklers, and it also can have electrical. But that's a kind of our overview. Now we're going to get a little bit more in depth on the detailing. The first one here is again, looking at this floor plan, this bank of townhomes, we can see that we have right here, this is our section marker that the previous, when we did the pen test, cut through front to back, which is a typical section of a dwelling unit. What I want to look at is our section through the common wall. That's what we're going to focus the most of our talk from here moving forward on. This is an example of an area separation wall installation detail, or ASW installation detail, for a 2-hour fire rated assembly. The detail itself over here on the right hand side comes from Georgia Pacific. It's a 2-hour fire separation wall with a design reference UL 373 is what we're really looking at here. And some of the key items that I'd like to point out is that it has an STC rating of between 65 and 69. Again, that comes down to what type of insulation, bad insulation, is going to be used in those cavities. Over here on the left-hand side at the bottom, our last bullet point is Appendix K out of the IRC says that a sound transmission, or STC rating, must be at least 45. Again, jumping back to what I said earlier on, that I understand that these appendices cannot be enforced. However, they do give a good benchmark, and looking at something that's a requirement of 45 and a design coming out with 65 to 69 does give a really good STC rating. But a couple things here is that this assembly has 2 layers of 1-inch shaft liner, and then it calls out for a minimum 3/4 inch airspace on both sides, and that must be maintained between the liner panels and the adjacent framing, right? The reason for that is this design is or this technique is designed so that if one unit was to catch fire, that unit was that it has clips that hold the separation wall to the framing. Those clips are, I believe, aluminum, so it allows it to melt and fall away without impacting the structure that's not under under the risk of fire. This is looking at the same design, but a couple different design techniques that are pretty important that I want to call out. So this again jumps back to the UL design, U373. Remember in the previous slide, it called out for a minimum 3/4 inch airspace between the framing and the area separation wall, or the shaft wall itself. This detail here calls out for 1 1/8 inch. What I want everyone to keep in mind here is that fire blocking has to be installed, and you can use this 1-inch shaft liner as a fire blocking, put it into place. But remember, I just called it a 1-inch shaft liner that's being installed in 1 1/8 inch airspace. So we're going to have voids. Those voids then also have to be filled both for fire blocking as well as air sealing. This wall is going to have, if you can envision, this is the inside of a unit, and then down here is the inside of another unit, and we're going to have um, electrical boxes being installed in these walls. So when they're installed, and if they're not airtight, you're going to have air exfiltrating from the conditioned space into this area separation wall assembly, and then it has to be. I wanted to refrain from using the term compartmentalized, because when we talk about compartmentalization, that means a different thing when running through different types of air testing with townhouses. So but we just want to make sure that if air does unfortunately find its way from the conditioned space into the unconditioned wall assembly, area separation wall assembly, that it remains within a small location and doesn't find its way, either getting into the unit next to it, or into the attic space above. So this is a picture of what this area separation wall looks like without the installation of insulation and the finished drywall. This is to the square right here, and this is the installation of what looks to be a gable end truss with a cathedral ceiling area. Um, you can see at this point that there are several areas of locations where air can absolutely exfiltrate from the conditioned space, get into this wall assembly below, and then get out up underneath the square there into unconditioned space. So we want to look closer into two additional details. What I have being shown here is the intermittent floors on the left-hand side. So this is looking from, let's say this is the first floor here. We have a floor assembly and then our second floor above. We have to define or have a user-defined air barrier. Previously, when we're looking at exterior walls on a standard detached dwelling, a lot of folks are stating that sheathing, their structural sheathing is going to be their air barrier. However, when looking at these details, when we're looking at an area separation wall, we're going to have to call this finished drywall as our air barrier, right? So when looking at that, we need to look at, if this is our air barrier and we have penetrations in that air barrier, if air gets through those penetrations, where does it then go? Those penetrations can be difficult to air seal. So that's the intermittent floor. And then over here on the right-hand side, this is our intersection of our conditioned space or second floor or first floor of a ranch to our attic space above. Again, we're going to have installed fire blocking here, but we also make sure that we have correct and adequate air sealing as well. So we're going to focus in on the intermittent floors first, and this red line is going to be kind of being drawn as our air barrier. So it runs up our drywall, and then we have our ceiling between, not our ceiling with a C, our ceiling with an S, ceiling that has some sort of a caulk mixture to it it's going to seal from our ceiling. Oh my goodness, they sound too much the same. Um, from our conditioned space here on our first floor and separating it from our floor framing assembly. So this can be our typical air sealing pen test, right? But we want to make sure that we're not allowing any air exfiltrating from our floor system into our area separation wall, top and bottom. Again, looking at the bullet points over here on the right, we have 1 inch shaft liner with 1 1/8 inch airspace. So the remaining eighth of an inch needs to be sealed at in our intermittent floor pen test. So we want to make sure that we incorporate our 1 inch shaft liner into the air sealing, and then ensure that all remaining cracks and gaps are filled with adequate and correct sealant for the application. Here's some examples of what this may look like. Forgive me for these pictures being a little bit grainy. They came from a previous webinar that was delivered back in July 10th, 2023. So credit to them for these photos, but I did want to show these two different areas which we are really looking at. This one over here on the left hand side, we're ensuring that the gap in the crack between the area separation, the shaft liner portion of the area separation wall, and the framing is indeed sealed at those critical areas. Also, we can't just focus in on the horizontal air sealing areas. We also need to look at the vertical areas as well. The other detail that we had briefly come up was the intersection at the roof, right? So here we have the second floor of a two-story, first floor of a ranch, with the intersection going from our conditioned space here to our unconditioned attic. The area separation wall must go from, well, it must go to the underside of the roof sheathing, right? So it continues above the square, all the way up to the underside of the roof sheathing. Again, running our pen test, our air barrier, defined air barrier, user-defined air barrier is probably going to be the drywall on the finished wall, and then the ceiling separating the conditioned from the unconditioned attic. But that again may not stop. We have to look at, are there penetrations below the fire blocking? If this is our fire blocking going from first floor to attic space, if there are penetrations, which there will be electrical penetrations in this drywall or user defined air barrier. If that leaks at all, we have to ensure that that doesn't then exfiltrate up to the attic space above. You can see here, this is the square, right? Here's the top of the uppermost wall. Here we have an insulation baffle being installed, so we know that this is our attic space up above. You can see the large area between the shaft wall product and the framing. That has to be air sealed. Otherwise, any sort of air that that exits through any sort of electrical opening boxes or whatnot can absolutely get up into that attic space, and that's a huge point of air loss. So I wanted to touch on this. This option came into play back in, I believe this one came in the 2018 IRC. So this is an alternative to the area separation wall. For years, folks have understood that the area separation wall construction method did have its downfalls when it came to air leakage. So this came into play in 2018, which is the double wall. So you have two independently built 1 hour fire resistant rated wall assemblies that fall within the UL 263 design content. So, before I often looked at this, it's like this may be very, very difficult to build under traditional construction methods for townhomes. Most of the time, townhomes that I've seen, the entire building, they're not built one unit at a time. It's first floor, then second floor, and they kind of went up that direction. I understand that it can be done other ways, but I've seen it done that way. So how would that be done when you have, um, you currently have a unit on one side and you're standing this second wall up? How do you then finish the backside of this drywall, at least to a point, so you meet the criteria for the fire resistant rated wall assembly? It could be difficult. Y- If this route was to be chosen, if you want to deviate away from the typical area separation wall that's using the 2 layers of 1 inch shaft liner to this method of two independent 1 hour walls, you'd kind of have to look at it, your construction methodology, in a different way. As being shown here, it does revert back to your building one unit, and then when that is built, or under roof, you would then build the unit next to it, and stand that wall up during the phase of construction. So it could potentially change the way you are scheduling and conducting the construction of that unit. However, it is an alternative to the area separation wall if you want to reduce the air leakage through that area separation wall. So looking at some key points in your common wall, be more detailed in your area separation wall pen test. Again, we looked at the whole unit pen test, and then when we're diving in to specific details within that area separation wall, you really need to take a closer look at running that pen test to ensure that you're closing up all areas for air infiltration. Use fire blocking locations as an added air sealing location, and then review alternative common wall designs, which would be the two 1 hour rated wall assemblies. Moving into the second point here, which is your exterior wall intersections or offsets. This is what we're looking at here, right? So we're going to call it unit one over here where it has the window, and then we have unit two over here, which is the walk-in closet. This intersection here is what we're going to look at. Looking at this picture here, you may be like, Chris, that doesn't happen. But if you look at the code in 2015, it said that the area separation wall, or that fire resistant wall assembly, must extend from the foundation to the underside of the roof sheathing. It didn't say anything about the intersection at your exterior walls. So this would have been code compliant. And as you can see, bullet point number one, daylight, which, yep, we can see quite a bit of that. Air moves based on pressure, not gravity. Already talked about that. And then, what does the sheathing attach to? This is from the inside looking out. Yikes. A lot of area for air leakage to occur in these locations. Thank goodness we've moved past that. And looking at the 2018 IRC, jumping down to the highlighted point part here, and it says that the wall shall be rated for fire exposure from both sides and shall extend to and be tight against exterior walls and the underside of the roof sheathing. So what that may look like is this right here, right? So our area separation wall is to the exterior, it's tight against the exterior wall. Um, Looking at the 2021, it says that common walls shall extend and be tight against the exterior sheathing and exterior walls, which is very, very similar to what you're reading in 2018, right? That we have the same situation here, but it goes beyond and says, or the inside face of the exterior walls without stud cavities. And again, to the underside of the roof sheathing. So these are two examples of what we're looking at looking forward into the 2021. This example over here on the right hand side is permissible. This is the language that it points you to. This is the design that the language points you to out of the 2018. But looking over here at the left hand side, this is an added design technique that can be incorporated looking forward into the 2021. As you can see, again, jumping back over here on the right, our area separation wall goes to the inside face of the sheathing, which getting into those tight crack areas can be very, very difficult for air sealing, right? If we want to jump back over here and look at where our air can be moving into that exterior wall, it's going to be jumping from our interior area separation wall and then sneak between those two studs on either side, getting into that exterior wall. Jumping over here to the right-hand side, our air movement without proper air sealing, has the potential to enter that area separation wall and then jump between that C channel, or those C runners as they call them in this detail right here, from one unit to the other unit. Again, um, both are acceptable in the 21. It's just this one over here on the right can be, again, it can be, I'm not saying it can't be achieved, but it can be a little bit more difficult to air seal when you have to get in between this stud and your area separation wall. Remember earlier, this has to be a minimum of 3/4 of an inch. The largest area we saw there was 1 1/8 inches. So that would be very difficult to get air sealing back here by those runners through 1 1/8 inch gap. Then the last item that I want to look at when it comes to our area separation wall is building offsets. Again, this is the perfect opportunity to enable the pen test if we want to identify or look at our user identified air barrier. That's typically our interior drywall on our interior unit here, as being shown with this line that depicts over to our section right there. This transition going from our interior drywall to what's typically our exterior wall air barrier, which is our sheathing, is very, very difficult. We had our blue line going from our interior to our exterior. This is the shaded area that's going between the studs. We're transitioning from 2x4 studs at the area separation wall to a 2x6 wall, exterior wall, and then continuing on the exterior. So oftentimes our air barrier does change when going from the common wall or area separation wall detail to a standard exterior wall. That transition is very, very important to detail correctly. I would believe that the house wrap or the sheathing coming down your exterior, finding some way to tie that sheathing with tapes or other means of air barrier products, tying that into that transition would be key. Again, showing the potential for air leakage. So key points for exterior wall intersections and offsets, be more detailed in your area separation wall pen test. Again, same thing as earlier. Remember, air barriers must be continuous. That is an important item when looking at this detail here. It must be continuous. You can change materials. Just because you change materials or user-defined air barrier materials, that does not mean it's not continuous. You just have to ensure that when combining those two different materials together, they are, well, they can be used together, right? Because remember earlier on, they have to be compatible for expansion and contraction. and then detail your air barrier transitions. When looking at where we are now, especially with the 2018 being 3 ACH50, we have to be very, very detailed in those details, right? It's our tolerances are getting smaller, therefore attention to detail is key. So the last thing that I want to touch on it's going to be a little bit more than 2 minutes, but we have 2 minutes left in today's webinar is alternative air sealing methods. This comes out of this is a true case study that came out of Cityscape magazine or publication, which this specific publication was published back in 2023. And the title of this is Increasing Innovation and Affordability in Housing, a case study on townhome area separation walls. The parameters of this case study, and again, down here at the bottom is a link to it. If you print the handouts, or not print them, but if you view the handouts on our website, all of our links that are on any of our slides should be active. So you should be able to click on this link and it'll take you right to this complete case study. But looking at the two different parameters, building one, this is coming from a builder in Colorado. Both of these units are built in the same area, just falling under two different parameters for testing methods. Building one was a 6-unit building. They installed the typical area separation wall approach only. They did not incorporate any additional alternative air sealing methods. And then they introduced an innovative aerosolized sealant. And those of you can already probably guess that you know what that aerosolized sealant is. And we'll touch on that in the next slide. Building two is a 5-unit building that has the typical area separation wall again installed, and then they incorporated alternative air sealing methods. So they went above and beyond to incorporate additional air sealing methods. And then they also introduced the innovative aerosolized sealant, which we can go on to say is the aero barrier product. If you're not familiar with aero barrier, it's an interior applied air sealant system that does fill gaps and cracks up to a 1/2 inch. And it's done if you envision running a blower door test in reverse. A blower door test typically depressurizes the house, so it sucks air out of the fan. During the installation of aero barrier, it runs in reverse, where it actually pressurizes the building and it pushes this waterborne sealant, aerosolized sealant that's in the air. It pushes that and it helps it find the gaps and cracks, and it collects upon itself and it fills up those areas. So looking at building one here on the left-hand side and building two, they are not identical. That may come into play a little bit with some of the testing results or preliminary testing results, but I just wanted to ensure that everybody was under these understanding that they are not identical units. So looking at the preliminary results, the typical air sealant prior to the additive of the air barrier ranged anywhere from 4 ACH50 to 7 ACH50. Um, when looking at the numbers, I'll show the numbers of all the units here coming up, but you'll see 3 different numbers. You'll see the typical air leakage prior to the installation of the air barrier. Then you'll see the air tightness, or the ACH50, during the installation process, and then you'll see the final blower door testing. The reason that number in the middle is a little bit higher is because of the temporary coverings that were added in the building itself. You have to cover horizontal surfaces because once that stuff settles, it is tacky. So there are added tapes and things of that nature that were installed for coverings, which helped reduce the air infiltration rate. So that's why you're going to see those numbers are a little bit different. And then, yeah. So looking at the numbers, you have building one here over on the left-hand side that had pre-aero barrier, and then blower door operation after aero barrier, and then the final blower door test. It's interesting to take a look at this because there's a lot of information that you can gather. First and foremost is looking at the difference in the ACH50 from your exterior units to your interior units. This clearly states that the area separation wall is a definite leakage point for air, right? So there's no question about it. When you have your exterior units, your end units coming in at um, a lower blower door test right off the bat, you know that the only separation or the only difference is that those interior units have that area separation wall, which again is a clear leakage point. So again, looking through these numbers, we're coming in at anywhere from 4 to 7 on both units. But the other thing that I want to point out here is that remember what I said earlier during the parameters. Building one did not take into account any additional air sealing techniques. Building two did. So those blower door numbers are kind of showing a little bit not what I would expect. I would expect that looking at building to these pre-aero barrier, these numbers here would be lower than these numbers here, simply because they used some advanced air sealing techniques on these units over here. Ultimately, though, the conclusion stated from this case, and again, these are conclusions that were stated in this case study, said that the method minimized worries regarding air sealing gaps, right? Because you had this aero barrier filling in those unseen gaps. The need it reduced the need for incorporating alternative air sealing methods. So when looking at the cost aspect, if you install your typical area separation wall, you do your air sealing techniques without going extremely above and beyond, in having to pay for those above and beyond air sealing techniques, this system, looking at the financial aspect, reduced the need for incorporating them. So you could save money on having somebody install them. However, you are then spending money on this alternative method. It reduced the need to caulk electrical boxes due to the aerosolized sealant filling those small gaps. And then this is a quote out of that document that said the benefit is that it could give builders a universal solution without code changes or differences across the jurisdictions, resulting in a more consistency with the potential for lower cost, right? Everything's not relative, right? So just because you're adding $10 here doesn't mean it's saving you $10 at a later point. Adding $10 here could just save you $20 at a later point. So that all has to be taken into consideration. And then jumping way back to the very beginning of the presentation where I talked about this disclaimer, again, it's our duty to show the industry or provide information to the industry so that you can all make the best decision based on what you're working in, right? We're not here to say that one method is better than another. It's for you to decide. It's simply for us to give you the educational content to give you the best tools in your toolbox to build the best product at the end of the day. So in summary, ultimately the lower we want to lower air infiltration, which ultimately lowers the energy consumption for the occupant. We all, again, want to have that same end goal, and that's providing the best product at the end of the day for the consumer. And if we can help them lower energy consumption, lowering air infiltration is one of the most cost-effective ways to do so. Air leakage through the area separation wall is equivalent to leakage to the outside. So just because you have a unit on the other side of that area separation wall does not make it okay for air leakage to enter that area separation wall. We need to seal it. And whether it stops at the electrical boxes or if it stops at all of our fire blocking with added air sealing techniques, we need to stop that air from movement. If it's fire blocked, then it needs to be air sealed. And sometimes we have to look outside of the box, and that looking outside of the box may be different details. It may be jumping from an area separation wall with two 1-inch shaft liner, that what we saw a lot of today, to potentially looking at two 1-hour walls, which changes it changes the dynamic of the construction of that unit, but it can give you a better it has the potential to give you a better outcome. You can also look at different air sealing techniques. Jumping to the aero barrier system might be a toolbox or a tool that you can install in your toolbox.